Okay, well, we are moving through church history. We're going to be on page 11. As we last week looked at the age of persecution, and this week we're going to look at the age of prosperity. Things are going to change in the history of the church, and it's going to change and impact the church and even impact us till today. How many of y'all went out and bought Justo Gonzalez's book? I'm just curious. I heard a few people went out and bought it. Oh, okay, nobody did. Okay, never mind. I will say that you can go online and Tertullian, you can read anything you want. Most of this stuff is free online that you can find because it's obviously there's no copyright on it. This was written 1,800 years ago. So I will say also, as you read some of these ancient works, and even as we look at Athanasius, as we look at Augustine, just remind you, none of these guys are perfect. And some of the things they're going to write, some of the things they're going to do, we can look back and question. And sometimes you want to throw out the baby with the bathwater, and I don't think that's wise. If you remember when we went through Hebrews 11, you look at the Great Hall of Faith, guess what? There's not a single one of them that doesn't have some issue that, in some sense, we could almost say disqualifies them. I mean, how can you put David in the Hall of Faith? How can you put Samson in the Hall of Faith? Jacob. Jacob's one of my spiritual heroes just for the simple fact that if God can love Jacob, he can love anyone, and he can love me. So understand that there are some things that we can emulate, that we can be challenged with, and also understand there's some mistakes that we can learn about. Even when we get to Martin Luther later on, there's some things he said against the Jews that are horrid. I mean, just horrid. And many people would say Hitler drew from that during the Holocaust. So, I mean, I can't excuse that. It was just, as he got later in life, he became a cantankerous old man. And that fiery spirit that enabled him to start the Reformation, your greatest strength is also your greatest weakness. It also caught him off guard, and his mouth sometimes got him in serious trouble. So I remind you that as you read Tertullian, you read some of these other guys, as we get to Bernard of Clairvaux, Augustine, if you want to critique and find things wrong, you definitely will, and I'm going to try to do my best to critique and so maybe some areas where they, in my opinion, got off track, and that can help us evaluate it. But just again, remind all of us that all of these men have clay feet, and aren't you glad God can use us despite that? Man, oh man, if his qualification was we had to be perfect, then none of us would qualify. And it also reminds us just to stay humble, because none of us got it all together, and it's just a good reminder. So, this is the age of prosperity. If you look on page 11, Christianity, even though it was persecuted, began to grow. It had threats from the Roman Empire, had threats from Gnosticism from the inside, and yet it continued to grow. If you pick up a book by Rodney Stark, again, he's a sociologist. He does not purport to write as a Christian. So again, if you pick up one of these books, you may find some things in here that you say, well, I don't know if I agree with that. Well, that's good. You may not agree with it. But from a standpoint of history and understanding how Christianity began to impact the Roman Empire, these are very good books. And he does a little bit of an analysis. This is actually the Triumph of Christianity, which is sort of an updated version of the Rise of Christianity. Now, I don't totally agree with the statistics, but they're based on a lot of research, based on records that they have, very limited. I mean, they're trying to figure out the population of the Roman Empire and how many Christians there were. That's almost an impossible task, but they can come up with some estimates. He estimates, and he's off here, he has to be, he says in AD 100, he estimates there's only 7,500 Christians, about 0.01%. He goes real low. I don't know why he does, because if you read the book of Acts, you already have 8,000 converts before you get into 3 chapters of Acts. So I don't know why he aims so low, but he does. But the rest of it seems to have some validity to it. He says by AD 150, 50 years later, you had 41,000 as a 0.07% of the population. He says by 200, you had 220,000, 0.36% of the population. By AD 250, you had 1.1 million, or about 2% of the population. And he estimates, and again, this is based on names. Sometimes they'll look at records, and a lot of names now are becoming Christian names. some other indications in the catacombs and those kind of things. He says by AD 300, there were 6.3 million Christians in the empire. 10% of the population. So in AD 300, you have 10% of the population who would claim the name of Christ or at least be in a Christian family. And so you have a pretty substantial number. People think the Roman Empire had about 60 million, so you're talking about 6 million people. So you're talking about from 120 in the upper room in Acts 1 to 6 million people. In an age when they were persecuted and bearing the name of Christ, depending on who's the emperor, could cost you your life, which is pretty amazing. Stark traces why in the world did it grow so much, and he gives 7 characteristics of Christians that had such an impact. One, they had high morality and a healthy life. Sinning is oftentimes not good for your health, and sexual morality and those kind of things have a way. He also says there were often a lot of plagues in the Roman Empire. He accounts several of them. And back then, if someone got the plague and you were a pagan, what'd you do with the person? You basically, you threw them out in the street, and you sort of hoped something, you just sort of wanted to get away from them. You ran away from them. Christians had a reputation, even among pagans, of taking care of their sick. And even taking care of someone with food and water and basic medical care oftentimes helped alleviate their death. And so you found that high morality and healthy life, Christians just generally live longer. Practical ministry to others, they had a great ministry, like I just said, during the plagues. There were apparently 1,500 widows that were enrolled at the Church of Rome who were receiving support from the Church of Rome, carrying out what Paul had said about taking care of the widows. And so it's an amazing practical ministry. You're talking about a society where there is no social welfare, and yet Christians were taking care of each other. Everyday evangelism, that's what Donald Tabb talked about this morning. These are not professionals going out. You don't have Billy Graham crusades back then. You have people every day who are sharing the gospel on a very one-on-one basis. And he accounts for the fact that social networks are always the way the gospel spreads. We sometimes look at the big crusades and think that's the way people are saved. No, it's when you win someone to Christ and they have a circle of influence and they win some of their friends to Christ, and that's how the gospel spread. Intentional discipleship. If you're living in an age of persecution, you want to make sure someone's serious. You don't just have them walk the aisle and you say, hey, let's vote them into membership right now. You didn't do that. You'd oftentimes have a 3-year catechism, and the purpose of that was to take them through and make sure they were serious about their faith. And so they were very intentional about discipleship. Strong appeal to women. Even though Christianity gets a bad name today, back then it was revolutionary. Stark accounts for the fact that in the empire, women, 20% were married by the time they were the age 12. Think about that. If you have kids, by the age of 12, they'd be married because women were not seen as having a whole lot of rights. They were seen for just basically to use however you'd want to, and so many older men had wives that were 12 or younger. By age 15, 50% of women in the Roman Empire and the pagan world were married. And if your husband died, what would you have to do? You'd have to get remarried. It was almost imperative. In fact, they say there was not even a word for a spinster in the Roman Empire because nobody, if you're a woman, that's the only way you could survive. He gives an example of Cicero. You ever heard of Cicero? He was a Roman statesman, a lawyer. He said his daughter was not untypical. She was married at 16, widowed at 22, remarried at 23, divorced at 28, married at 29, divorced at 33, and dead after childbirth at age 34. Another woman was said to have married 8 times within 5 years. There was a shortage of women in the empire, and why was that? Yeah, infanticide, abortion. It's almost like what you see in China. They didn't want girls. And so if you had a baby girl, oftentimes that baby would be exposed or aborted. They said, I think he says in Stark's book, he says that in their family records, they could only find, Even in large families, more than one daughter was rarely ever reared. A study based on inscriptions was able to reconstruct 600 families and found that of these, only six out of 600 families had raised more than one daughter. So you have a society that does not value women, and what does Christianity do? Christianity elevates that, and not only that, but even says that the single life is an okay life for women, and supported women who were widows, so they didn't have to necessarily go and get remarried. And they said the average Christian girl, only 50% that were married were 18 or older, and so you're having a situation where it's totally the opposite of what was happening in the pagan world. So strong appeal to women, plus the Roman mindset was you have a wife for respect and you have a concubine for pleasure, and you can have as many as you want. And the Christian sexual ethic said no, the morality for women is the same for men, and so therefore it had a high appeal to women. Firmness in persecution, obviously, as Tertullian said, the blood of the martyrs is the seed of the church, and the message of God's love, which was totally radical. The whole concept that God loved us enough to enter our world and to die for us was totally radical in that society where the gods were seen as passive. They were totally uninterested, and yet this is talking about a God who was interested in us and loved us. So I'd say it's a pretty good prescription for how the church can grow in our culture as well. High morality, practical ministry, everyday evangelism, intentional discipleship, strong appeal to women, firmness, persecution, message of God's love. It worked back then, and it certainly is how we can impact our culture today. By the way, wasn't Donald Tabb's message this morning powerful? And, oh yeah, you can clap. He won't hear it, but very good challenge. And again, you see how God uses someone with that kind of passion for the gospel, and it was a good reminder. He reminded me of a pawpaw. You remember when I went through Proverbs and Ecclesiastes, and I said when Solomon wrote Proverbs, he was writing as a father, and when he wrote Ecclesiastes, he was writing as a pawpaw? Because pawpaws don't have any filters anymore. They just say exactly, and I try to, sometimes my dad comes, and it's like, pawpaw, you can't say that, Anyway, he preached from the heart and no inhibitions. Anyway, so that's the rise of Christianity. Okay, so now what's going to happen? Great persecution. Diocletian becomes the emperor of Rome in 284, and the church had experienced relative peace, and it seemed like it was going to continue to have peace because his wife and his daughter were both Christians. Diocletian takes over, and the empire is in trouble. Let me read a description of the empire when Diocletian takes over. This is AD 300. This is what's going on in the empire. Hatred and envy reigned everywhere. The peasants hated the landowners and the officials. The city proletariat hated the city bourgeoisie. That's the middle class, right? And the army was hated by everybody. Work was disorganized and productivity was declining. Commerce was ruined by the insecurity of the sea and the roads. Industry could not prosper since the market for industrial products was steadily contracting and the purchasing power of the population was diminishing. Agricultural passed through a terrible crisis. Prices constantly rose and the value of the currency depreciated at an unprecedented rate. The relations between the state and the taxpayer were based on more or less organized robbery. Forced work, forced deliveries, forced loans and gifts were the order of the day. The administration was corrupt and demoralized, and the most terrible chaos thus reigned throughout the ruined empire. Does that sound familiar? The glory days were passing. They were trying to maintain the same standard of living, but they couldn't do it. They said that Diocletian increased the government to its largest size. He had 35,000 people employed by his government. Taxes then rose, which caused, again, people hated each other, and people especially hated the army, the people that were trying to enforce order. So Diocletian comes to power, and he wants to restore Rome. And if I can say it, he wanted to make Rome great again. But back then, that was not going back to the values of America. It was going back to the pagan values of Rome. Same kind of thing. The world's in crisis. The empire's in crisis. It's diminishing. How do we make it great again? Well, ultimately, he decided, along with Galerius, that they were going to go back to the Roman gods, and therefore Christians were going to be persecuted. Again, to remind you, you had a western side that spoke Latin and an eastern side that spoke Greek primarily, and Diocletian came up with a plan. I have my marker board. I'm excited. I hope I can. Oh, I put them on the wrong side. That was a bummer. Oh, well. This was the eastern side, even though it's on the western side. And then you had, is it Maximian, I think, and Constantius. So sorry, I put them backwards. But he came up with a plan. He said, it's too big to try to rule this empire by myself. And so I'm going to be the Augustus, and this is going to be my vice emperor, Galerius. And on the western side, you had Maximian, and he had a vice emperor, Constantius. And his thought was, when I abdicate, then Galerius takes over, and he brings a vice president on board, and the same goes over here. Because what was happening, every time somebody died or the emperor died, there was turmoil because there was who's going to succeed him. So he thought he had a great plan. Galerius, many people think, is the one who hated Christians the most. Again, Diocletian wanted to restore the power and the glory of Rome, but Galerius was the one that seemed to have a hatred for Christians. He was a military man. He looked at Christians as being a detriment because they either didn't join the military or when they got in there, they questioned whenever there was needless violence. They sort of had a question about why we needed to do that if it wasn't necessary. And so he began to do some policies. His first policy was this: all Christians are to be expelled from the military. He got that first. He said, let me just clean the military out from Christians. Let's just get those Christians out of there because they're not good for morale, and we'll expel them from that. No need to get worried because we're just removing them from the military. 8 years later, though, there's a second policy. Christians are to be removed from all government positions, and all Christian books are to be destroyed. That's a pretty big step. In those 8 years, he goes from just expelling from the military to creating a climate where people started to hate Christians and feel like they were the ones who were causing all the problems. The reason things are going downhill is because of the Christians. And so we're going to remove them from the government, and all Christian books are to be destroyed. And then finally, his third policy takes effect the following year, that all Christians must sacrifice to the gods. If we're going to restore the honor and glory of Rome, then we have to go back to the gods, and that means everyone has to sacrifice to the gods. It's the same thing that Decius had said. You have to have some formal document that says you were willing to go and sacrifice to the gods, and get a document saying that you had done that. As you can see, that's sort of how persecution works. In fact, someone says there's 5 stages of persecution. First, you stereotype the person that you want to, or stereotype Christians. Then you vilify them, call them homophobic, call them mean, call them closed-minded. Then you marginalize them. You start removing them from the public positions and from the military. Then you begin to criminalize. If you believe certain things, then you're criminalized. And then finally, it's full-scale persecution. And that's what happened here. And so Christians who had had a time of relative peace for 40 years, suddenly they're faced again with this decision. And many people complied. Some people just complied and went ahead and got a sacrifice, got a certificate. Some of them fled and hid. Many of them were tortured and killed. Diocletian eventually, he abdicates, or he resigns, and Maximian resigns. Galerius becomes now the new main guy, and he takes a guy by the name of Maximinus Daia. Meanwhile, over here, Constantius ends up, who does he end up with? Actually, I think he goes down too, doesn't he? I don't have it yet. Okay, he's eventually going to be Maxientius. It's going to be his co-chairman, his co-vice president. So when Galerius now takes over, now he can do his full-scale persecution, and he begins to do that. And so violent persecution continues for the next 7 years. People are being killed for their faith. People are being challenged to, some people will comply, and then they're going to be considered people who give up on Christian books, and they hand them over to the authorities, or they sacrifice to the gods. And that's going to be a problem for the church later on when you try to figure out what to do with these people, because they had lapsed and they had been part of not standing up for their faith. Anyway, this continues for 7 years, and then something happens to Galerius. He gets stricken with a painful disease. And there's a picture of him. You know something about his eyes? Many people think he had hyperthyroidism that led to a Graves' disease. I'm not familiar with it too much, but they said he became a very painful disease and caused all kinds of strange symptoms with him. He was stricken with a painful disease, and he thought it was God's punishment for his actions. And what did the Christians say? Yep, that makes a lot of sense to us. And so he eventually, in the midst of this painful disease, he issues an edict allowing Christians to worship freely as long as they kept the public order. And then he asks them to pray for him. Here's his edict. With all the laws which we have decreed for the good of the state, we have sought to restore the ancient rules and traditional discipline of the Romans. We have particularly sought to have Christians who had abandoned the faith of their ancestors return to the truth. So he still believes paganism is the truth. Many obeyed for fear of danger, and we were forced to punish others. In other words, we were forced to punish them. We didn't want to, but we forced to do it. But there are still many who persist on their opinions, and we are aware that they neither worship nor serve the gods. Therefore, moved by our mercy to be benevolent towards all, it has seemed just to us to extend to them our pardon and allow them to be Christians once again, and once again gather in their assemblies as long as they do not interfere with public order. In another edict we shall instruct our magistrates regarding this matter. In return for our tolerance, Christians will be required to pray to their God for us, for the public good and for themselves, so that the state may enjoy prosperity and they may live in peace. Nevertheless, a few days later, he died. So whether the Christians didn't pray for him or it was just his time, he eventually dies. After his death, the empire is divided now among 4 rulers. I'm trying to keep this straight over here. Maximinus, Dia, and I think it's Licinius. Is that right? Licinius on this side. Again, this is the eastern side, even though it's on the wrong side. Over here, Constantius is replaced by his son, Constantine. These guys weren't very creative in their names. Maximian has Maxientius, and Constantius has Constantine. They sort of like their names. And so these are the situation here. And Constantine, once he takes over, he's a very able military guy, and he's over in the Great Britain area. He begins to move. Let me go back over here to this map. He's over here in this area, Constantine, and he begins to move towards Maxientius, who is over here in Rome. He begins to conquer him and move towards Rome because Constantine does not want to share his rulership with another person. He wants to rule the entire western side. And so the night of the battle, he is moved all the way to Rome. They say Maxientius, if he were to stay in Rome, he probably could have won the war. But he listens to an oracle. He goes to a pagan fortune teller, and the pagan fortune teller tells him that on October 28th, the enemy of the Romans is going to die. It's October 26th. Constantine is out there a few miles away, and he in his mind thinks, I can't wait for him. I want to get there so I can kill him on October 28th. And so he leaves Rome and goes out to head off into battle against Constantine. Constantine, the night before that battle, has a vision, and in that vision, he sees a sign in the sky that says, in this sign you shall conquer. And this is called the Chi Rho, or the Labarum. Can y'all see that? It's the first 2 letters in Greek of the name Christ, Christos. And apparently he sees that vision, and he's told in this sign to conquer. He takes that, obviously, as a sign from God. He has all his soldiers put that on their shield. Well, the next day, October 28th, the day that Maxientius has the idea that the enemy of the Romans is going to die, they meet in battle, and guess who wins? Constantine. And many people think the enemy of the Romans was not Constantine, it was Maxientius. And so he misunderstood the oracle, or it just wasn't a very good oracle. But he is killed. That's the story of, if you ever heard of the Battle of the Milvian Bridge, apparently if you go to Italy, you can still see the bridge. It goes over the Tiber River. His army goes across the bridge, and then as they're trying to retreat, they're all trying to go across this bridge that could not support them, and the bridge collapsed, and he apparently falls, Maxientius falls into the water, and when you fall into the water with your armor on, it's not a good thing, and he drowns. Once Constantine takes over here on this side, Licinius, he's the same thing. He doesn't want to share his rule. He eventually becomes the ruler over in the east. Constantine becomes the ruler over in the west. and they together passed the Edict of Milan, February 313. And if you want to mark an important date in Christian history, remember 313. So remember 64, when the Great Fire of Rome, that begins the persecution. Then remember 313, because that's when the Edict of Milan. And this is the edict that officially ends all persecution of Christians. It does not make Christianity the official religion of the empire, but it does, in some sense, it stops persecution. In many ways, it endorses Christianity because it appears that Constantine is a Christian, or at least he gives that appearance. Eventually, Constantine and Licinius go to battle. No one's ever satisfied with just ruling half of the empire. They go to battle in 322, and apparently Licinius tells his army, whatever you do, don't look at that symbol. Don't look at it, because it's got powers, magical powers. So he tells his army not to look at the symbol. Well, Constantine's put that symbol on all his soldiers' shields. It's not real helpful to tell your soldiers not to look at the shields when they're in battle. I'm not sure where they can look. And anyway, Constantine defeats Licinius, and now Constantine is the ruler and controller of the Roman Empire. In order to stabilize his kingdom, he moves the main capital from Rome. Remember, he's already ruled this side, him and his father, or at least on the western side, so he's not as concerned about this side. He wants to make sure he moves his capital over there, because that's the eastern side where he is not ruled. And so he establishes this town called Constantinople, which is now modern-day Istanbul, which is a pretty strategic place and a beautiful city, and it would be a great place to go visit, because apparently you can still see some of the monuments that he built. And so Constantine, and this changes everything. You go from an age of persecution to an age of prosperity immediately. Big question, did he really become a Christian? We'll look at that. Before we go there and look at the appendices, let me just introduce Athanasius, because he's going to be the next person we look at. It's on page 13. He's called the primary defender of the deity of Christ against the Arian heresy. We're going to talk about that. His Easter letter is the first official church document listing the complete New Testament canon. Now, again, some people get a wonder about that, but remember, the canon was pretty much established. There were just a few books that they were questioning, like the book of Jude, because it was so similar to 2 Peter, the book of Hebrews, because they couldn't figure out who the author was, though they were convinced it had apostolic origin. That was in Revelation, just because many people couldn't understand it. But those were only books that were questioned about by some people, and now that the church is free from persecution, now they can finally get together and understand the books that have been seen as Scripture since day one. And this is the first official document listing the New Testament canon. He's the author of a book called Life of Anthony, which was a best-selling biography of a monk that impacted early Christians and called them to a simplistic, committed lifestyle. He's a good one to talk about because at the age of 13, remember he grew up under persecution. At the age of persecution, at the age of 13, he's suddenly going to see Christianity totally change from a persecuted religion to now one that's going to be favored in the empire. So he experienced the transformation of Christianity from despised, persecuted faith to accepted, even popularized. 5 changes are going to take place. Are you ready to, if you have your book, here's where you get to go look at one of your appendices. Flip back to page 52. Page 52. Are you with me so far? Hanging in there? Okay. Constantine's impact. One of the first questions on page 52 is, did he really become a Christian? Obviously, we don't know. Only God knows the heart. It's the same question you have when you read Nebuchadnezzar and Daniel. You know, it sure sounds like he did, but then when you read secular history of it, you're not sometimes so sure. Constantine did have something dramatic happen to him. You can't deny that. Some people say he had nothing to gain from supporting Christians. They were persecuted. They only represented 10% of the population. His mother was a devout believer. There's few people that question that. He did many positive things to support and promote Christianity, and he was baptized as a Christian on his deathbed. However, on the other side, he still worshiped the unconquered sun and participated in pagan rituals after his conversion. He never placed himself under the teaching authority and accountability of the church. He willingly took the title of high priest of paganism and made preparations to be declared a god after his death. He had many statues of himself placed around the city, one with his head replacing the Greek god of Apollo. All these people like finding these statues and putting their heads on it and trying to proclaim themselves as gods. And he continued to act as a typical Roman emperor, ordering the executions of his eldest son, his second wife, and his favorite sister's husband for alleged treason. So is he just acting like the Roman emperors, and that's what you have to do to keep control of the empire? Or was he not truly a believer? Again, I don't know. All I can say is his change of heart definitely had an impact. The most obvious impact is the mass influx of people into the churches. You remember when I did 6 million people in 300 AD? Do you see the statistic of what happened 50 years later? Is that a better marker? You go from 300 AD, you got 6 million. 50 years later, after this, how many do you have? 34 million in an empire that they estimate of 60 million who would claim to be Christians. How many of them do you think were truly Christians? What has happened is it used to be a Christian would hinder your climb up the social and political ladder. Now to be a Christian elevates your climb up the social and political ladder. And so if you're going to send out your little campaign mailers in the mail, you used to always put, he's a faithful member at the Church of Dionysius in downtown Carthage. And, people, oh, okay, yeah, I'm going to vote for him. I like him. That doesn't get you anywhere anymore. Now you have to put, he's a faithful member at First Baptist of Carthage, and him and his family, and you got them on the front of their little mailer card trying to advertise the fact that they're Christians. What does it do when the church explodes from 6 million to 34 million people in 50 years? And the implication is all the people flooding into the church are not really coming because they are interested in trusting Jesus Christ as their Savior. Yeah. It would be like something changed in our culture, and suddenly, within the next year, this church of 300 suddenly becomes a church of 3,000. And these are not people who are coming with a Judeo-Christian background. They're coming from a totally pagan background. And they're flooding into the churches because this is the place to be now. 5 things begin to happen. And you can look on page 53, and if you want to fill in your blanks later on whatever page it was with Athanasius. I just want to go over these 5 things before we go into Athanasius' life. Monasticism began to flourish. The first thing, monasticism began to flourish. There were some people who were going to be monks before, but now, as Gonzalez notes, there was a mass exodus from the church. Why was there a mass exodus from the church? Well, you have all these pagans flooding in, and the people who were just, they were used to a smaller kind of worship and a more intimate kind of worship, and now thousands of pagans are coming in. Many people who were the committed and the strongest said, you know what, I'm getting out of here. This is not what I signed up for. This is not the way it was supposed to be. And many of the faithful, many of the more committed, maybe some of them were a little radical, but they began to leave and go out into the desert sort of to form their own communities and get away from this mass influx of people. The second thing that happened is basilicas are built. Where did people meet generally before this time? If you were at a church, in a house. There were some houses that they can find archaeologically that had been altered that could maybe hold 50 to 100 people. But for the most part, people met in houses. Obviously, when the church began, they could meet in the temple courtyards. But now that Constantine, you think he's going to go to someone's house and worship? Nope. And so they began to build these massive basilicas, which had very much the flavor of some of the great Roman buildings. And if you look at what Gonzalez says, after Constantine's conversion, Christian worship began to be influenced by imperial protocol. Incense, which was used as a sign of respect for the emperor, began appearing in Christian churches. Officiating ministers, who until then had worn everyday clothes, began dressing in luxurious garments. Likewise, a number of gestures indicating respect, which were normally made before the emperor, now became part of Christian worship. The custom was also introduced at beginning services with processional. Choirs were developed partly in order to give body to that procession. Eventually, the congregation came to have a less active role in worship. What used to be a very active, participatory kind of worship now became, let's just come and watch the show. And that began to influence the Christian church. The third thing was increasing hierarchy developed in the clergy. Yeah, there was always leadership in the church. There was always a sense of someone who had authority and that the church was to follow their leadership. But now, of course, remember back then, if you became a church leader, you oftentimes were the target of persecution. So people didn't want to become a clergy just because, or become a pastor just because of the perks, because it might end up getting you killed. But now there's perks, as you can see on page 54, tax exemptions, you get political influence and position, and what happens is the clergy become more and more like political leaders because now it becomes a power position, and the gap between the clergy and the laity begin to widen, and you have a clerical aristocracy. The fourth thing that happens is paganism influenced church practices. You have a flood of 28 million pagans coming into the church. What are they going to do? They're going to bring a lot of their pagan mindset and pagan practices. There's a book by McMullen, who's a historian at Yale. He's not there anymore, but considered a great historian. He wrote a book called Christianity and Paganism in the 4th and 8th centuries. And in that book, he sort of begins to show how the church, trying to teach and accommodate these pagans coming into church, sometimes may have accommodated too much. For when peace came after so many and such violent persecutions, crowds of pagans wishing to become Christians were prevented from doing this because of their habit of celebrating the feast days of their idols with banquets and carousing. And since it was not easy for them to abstain from these dangerous but ancient pleasures, our ancestors thought it would be good to make a concession for the time being to their weakness and permit them, instead of the feast they had renounced, to celebrate other feasts in honor of the holy martyrs, not with the same sacrilege, but with the same elaborateness. He goes on to talk about Augustine had such a hard time trying to teach his people that they could pray directly to God. In their minds, God was sort of this transcendent being that you could only go and pray about important things. God was not interested if your hen was sick. You know, if you're a farmer and your hen's not laying eggs or your hen is sick, God doesn't want to hear that prayer. I can't pray to God. And so they had different pagan gods that they could pray to, and they were sort of upset because they didn't know quite how to bring that request to God. And so the church, in accommodating to them, began to have certain saints that you could pray to and look to handle some of these smaller things that certainly God didn't want to be bothered with. So that Augustine has to say, basically in a sermon, you see at the end of that paragraph, God heals both man and beast, yes, even your flocks and herds. Let us reduce it to the very least things he sees, to the salvation of your hen. And he's trying to implore them to understand not spiritual salvation, but if your hen's sick, God cares about that, if that's part of your sustenance, and therefore you can bring it to God. Other, probably having pagan roots, spiritual power and relics, spiritual protection and wearing a necklace or having a Christian symbol or a statue at your house, saying certain phrases over and over, even celebrating the birth of Christ on December 25th. Now, there is some controversy there because we do think there was a pagan holiday on that day, the birthday of the sun, and the church sort of adopted that with Christianity. However, there's also fairly good evidence that December 25th was seen as a potential day of Christ's birthday. No one knew when Christ was born. Some people said January 6th. We celebrate Epiphany then. Some people thought it was then. Some people picked March. Some people picked September. The theory on how December 25th became the day that some people thought Christ was born on was many people picked March 25th as the day that he died, and they thought that his life would be a perfect symmetry, and so if he died on March 25th, he had to be conceived on March 25th, which meant 9 months later would be December 25th. So some people say that know that December 25th was already in the mindset of people as a possible birthday, But it does seem to be that there was some kind of feast day and some kind of holiday there, and so they brought in Christmas and brought in the birth of Christ to sort of accommodate with some of the beliefs that the people had. And then the fifth impact was hope was turned from heaven onto earth. Up until this time, people are looking forward to the return of Christ. Maranatha becomes a key prayer of the church, O Lord, come. The early church was premillennial. They were always looking premillennial. They're looking for Christ to come back and set up his kingdom on earth. Now they're going to turn to more amillennial and say that there is no coming kingdom, that we live in an age that's sort of like the kingdom and Christ is reigning now in a spiritual sense. And so looking towards the hope of Christ's return began to be diminished. Whew. Did you catch all that? I just hit you with a lot of stuff. Questions that you may have, because I know there's a lot of questions when you get to this part here. Any questions? Any thoughts? Because they don't know. Yep. Yes, Bob. Yeah, yeah. Well, the reality is, historically, it's hard to deny that what the church was like in the first 300 years has radically changed after that. I mean, I don't know how you can deny it. Now, you can. Now, here's the million-dollar question. Because there were some that were Donatists who wanted to purify the church. And they became very radical in purifying the church. And I grew up in a home where I had some brothers and sisters who were in a part of a King James only church, and they thought the church was so paganized and were very aware of some of the roots to some of the practices. And they would reject even things that Protestants do. I mean, hey, I celebrate December 25th. And so they want to purify it totally of paganism. And I guarantee if you go online, you'll find someone that finds out December 25th has possible pagan roots, and man, and people latch on to that. Or is it okay to have a choir? Is it okay to have an order of service? Is it okay to conduct church in a way that you could encourage people to be more spectator? Those are all tough questions. I would say there's no way you can totally eliminate the paganism. Every time you have a Sunday, Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, Saturday, those are pagan days. You know why we wear this? Because the Romans did. And they thought that somehow there was a vein there that went to your heart. And so it was a sort of not pagan, I guess you could say, but it wasn't Christian. There's nothing that says you put a ring on your finger. So at some point, you have to say, I think we are to contextualize our message, but at what point do you contextualize it and you lose the heart of that message? And that's the challenge, because there were some things here that changed that impacted, I think, the way that the church sees itself and the church sees its pastors and the way the church sees the death of Jesus Christ. And so those are the things that are bigger impacts. That's a long answer. Am I critiquing Roman Catholicism? Well, yeah. I mean, there's obviously a bringing in some of the things that you see in that church. You are bringing in a Constantine imperial thing that in itself may not always be bad, but when it starts impacting how people view doctrine, it can be. Yes? Oh, most definitely. Yep. Yep. Yeah. 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 I do want you to see, though, what has changed. Do you see what's changed? And again, some people want to go back to, let's go back to first century, and I think that's a good thought. I think you want to make sure what you do from the Bible is your guide. But again, there are some things that are, you have freedom in Christ, and there are some things that don't impact doctrine, and I think you can have those kind of impact in the church. But again, you don't want it to ever be such a situation where there's not a sense that this is a congregation and that I am a believer who's got issues just like you. And there's nothing that makes me more spiritual because I stand up here. In fact, I'm held to the same standard and even to a higher one. So, but that's history, and I don't think you can deny it. That's just sort of what happened in that time period. Any other questions? Yes. Well, we're going to get to it when we get to the medieval time period. That's coming up because these things start, and there are still some very solid, strong believers and solid things going on. But over time, this is going to begin to be a problem. And so what starts off here, when you get to the time of the Reformation, now has gone to its full scope, and now you have lots of problems. And so this is where it begins. Someone has compared this. There's a Greek mythology about a guy named, I can't remember his name, Aetius or Antius or something. He was a Greek god whose mother was the goddess of the earth. And he liked to wrestle people because when they wrestled him and they threw him to the ground, when he touched the earth, which was his mother, he gained strength and he came back stronger. Hercules realized as he's wrestling him, every time he threw him to the ground and tried to crush him, he gained more power and gained more power. And so the way Hercules eventually defeated him was he suddenly realized he's getting power when I throw him to the earth. So Hercules picked him up and held him up high. And when he held him up high, he began to lose more and more power until eventually Hercules could destroy him. And many people say Satan was trying to destroy the church and was throwing it to the ground, persecuting it, and finally he said, you know what, I'm going to try a different strategy. I'm going to exalt it, and I'm going to lift it high, and I'm going to give it power and influence and political credit and influence, and by holding up high over time, it lost more and more of its power so that it could be more easily defeated. That's a pretty powerful illustration. I don't want persecution. I pray we never have persecution. But you look at the nations where the church is persecuted, and they have something we don't. And we have to be honest with that. And if God chooses to say it's time to purify the American church, it'd be something I do not want, I do not pray for, but it may be the thing that the church would need. And I think we have to at some point say, God, I trust you. And like the Hebrews said, you run the race that's set before you with endurance. Again, you can take this as critique any way you want, but historically this is what happened, and it has impacted the church, and we have to be aware of that and know how do you respond to that. What things are you free in Christ? What things are contextualizing the gospel so people can understand, hey, when the gospel missionaries go to other countries, they do contextualize the gospel to try to help it make sense to the people there. And there's some good practical reasons to do that. But at some point, that contextualization can go so far that you lose the core message of the gospel. And every missionary I know struggles with where that line is. And I think every church has to struggle with where that line is as well.